Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our World AIDS Museum Spotlight interview series. And I'm Andy Ruffner. I'm the Director of Education and Programming here at the museum. And we're very happy to have with us today Sean Strub, who is the founder of Paws magazine, among many other things that we'll be talking about with him today. And we're very happy to have you on the show, Sean.
Thank you, Andy. I'm very happy to participate, and I'm really pleased that the museum is undertaking this series to document the stories of some of us old timers.
Well, they're wonderful stories, and we've had a great time learning more about the actual real lives of the people that have worked so hard on all of these things. So I had some background information on you I wanted to share with the public today. Unfortunately, my colleague, Dr. Raquel Lopes, our executive director, wasn't able to be with us today. So I'm doing this one solo, but some of the background that I've had is that you're currently the mayor of Milford, Pennsylvania.
I am.
And how long have you been doing that?
About 5 years. I was appointed to complete a term of a mayor who resigned. Then I got elected to a 4-year term in 2017, and I'm running for re-election this year.
Ah, okay, great. And you've been living with HIV for more than 35 years, I understand, right?
Actually, probably now. We think I was SERO converted in the summer of 1980, so I'm over 40 years now, based on the medical records that tested positive when the test came out. But...
Right. Okay. And significantly, I mentioned earlier, I actually have an example. This is an oldie. This is from 1995. You were the founder of Paws magazine. I believe that started in '94. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you've written a book called Body Counts, a memoir of politics, sex, AIDS, and survival that came out in 2014. It's a very good read. And then you've written 2 books on corporate responsibility. And this is really interesting. We just did a program a couple of months ago with the SERO Project. You're the executive director of the SERO Project, which is a US-based health national network of people living with HIV that's best known for its work in combating HIV criminalization. The short film that you produced is called HIV is Not a Crime, which introduced the problem of HIV criminalization to audiences and advocates around the world. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So all of these things, this is amazing, all the different things that you've done in your life and all the people that you have worked with and touched along the way in that. And so thinking about, awareness, advocacy, activism, these things, where does all that come from? That all this energy and passion and in those early days, especially courage, how did all that come about for you?
Well, I think that a part of, for many people, especially of my generation, growing up queer comes with a sort of sense of being an outsider, and I think that being an outsider lets one look at things from a different perspective. And I grew up in Iowa City, which is a university town, in the 1960s and 70s. It was a very vibrant, politicized community around feminism and anti-war protests and the civil rights movement. And while my family, that wasn't the family background I came from. I come from a conservative Catholic family. My father was in business. That was where I found a home, where I didn't feel that comfort about myself in my immediate family or in school or whatever. I found it with the activism students at the University of Iowa, who were older than I, but introduced me to all sorts of social justice work. So that's kind of where that came from. And I was already involved as a gay rights activist in the late 70s and early 80s when the epidemic hit. And it's kind of you to label that early activism as courageous or something like that. but I always point out that I'd like to think of myself as courageous, but it was also really just about trying to survive. There was a courage is a lot easier to find when the alternative is is dying. And the epidemic hijacked my life at when I was in my early 20s, and it wasn't something that was a decision that I made. It was just about how did I cope with surviving and with dealing with the loss of so many friends, and then as one gets involved and uh, one goes from a sense of powerlessness to really realizing how much an individual can affect things in their communities and their policy and so on. It builds on itself. That's how I describe my activism coming from, and it continues today. I continue to learn from it and to grow as an activist. That's a lifelong process. That's not something that just happens and there you are.
Mhm. I'm always curious about identity around things like this, and thinking about these words that we use, activist or advocate or artist, along the way. So for you, at what point did you sort of take that on and own it, that yeah, I'm an activist? I mean, was that, at what point did that happen? How did that occur for you, that you would have said to people, yeah, I am an activist?
Um, I think when others sort of applied the label to me, uh, I've never been real comfortable categorizing myself in different labels, because like a lot of people, sorry, that's a door slamming. Like a lot of people, I exist in multiple worlds and multiple identities, right? Um, uh, and sometimes, labels, activist or whatever, they become a shorthand. So sort of, kind of explaining a perspective or something. So I don't know that I particularly embraced any of these things, but it just became what others labeled what I was doing, and so that's fine. I'll go with whatever anyone wants to call it.
Yeah, I think it's there's an interesting parallel there with what you were saying earlier about whether or not to label it courageous, because it was just about surviving. And I think that's one of the things that struck me in my own work, is that sometimes in just trying to say, hey, I want a fair deal here, I want a fair shake, or the people that I'm working with, the kids, I did a lot of work with GLSEN, the Gay Lesbian Straight Education Network, and simply standing up and saying, hey, kids shouldn't be bullied because of sexual orientation. That becomes activism. And I didn't really think it was that revolutionary to say that, but apparently it was. And I remember the first time I saw that behind my name, I thought, well, not really, but okay. Just speaking up a lot of times is activism.
But we live in a society where speaking the truth is activism.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many warnings about don't go there. Don't rock the boat around those things. So talk about, I think the founding of Paws magazine, that was a really big thing. So it started in '94, I think you said?
Right. Its origins were before that. Very early in the epidemic, even by late '83 or '84, I had become kind of like the information hub amongst my circle of friends. Um, I was like interested in following it, and I knew, from the very beginning, from that New York Times story in the summer of '81, that whatever this was, it had something to do with me. It described symptoms that I'd had: night sweats and weight loss and swollen lymph glands. I was at school at Columbia. I was at the Columbia University Health Service because I had such a lump behind my ear that they first thought was a contusion. And it turned out it was a swollen lymph gland. Um, uh, so the so I quickly became the one who was like talking about it with my friends, and sometimes to their consternation. I remember the dinner party. Well, can we talk about anything other than AIDS tonight? And like, no, I'll keep talking about it. And then in the late 80s, when fax technology was new. Of course, no one uses fax machines anymore, but there was a time when it was the novel, new, radical thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I would find articles and started faxing them to friends around the country. And that turned into, once ACT UP started in '87, I'd go to the ACT UP meetings on Monday nights, and people were sharing things in the back of the room. There'd be something handwritten out and Xeroxed about what someone was experiencing or what they were doing to treat what was going on, or articles or whatever. And I'd take copies of those, and then I would Xerox them, and we made them into a little packet, and we started sending that out by mail, every couple of weeks to people around the country. And then I was in the direct mail fundraising business and was doing a lot of the LGBT and AIDS groups, and a mail order pharmacy wanted us to market their services. And I wasn't really interested in that in particular, but we had this database that we could reach people, and we were a trusted voice around AIDS issues because of all the direct mail fundraising we did. We're well informed. And Stephen Gendon, who was working with me at the time, and a really important activist who died about 21 years ago, Stephen kept talking to the guy from this company, and he got them to agree to fund a newsletter. And Stephen was really interested in sharing the news, and we were doing this packet. We were Xeroxing and stuffing things and sending it out. And Stephen got them to fund, well, let's do a newsletter. We call it the CPS Info Pack, Community Prescription Service Info Pack. And we quickly were producing thousands of those. But that was sort of, I used to joke that was for the science club. And I was a science club dropout. I'm not a science person, much more kind of humanities and arts oriented. And so I started thinking about, beyond the science club that could read about the treatment advances and the more technical stuff, how could we share with other people who had HIV some of the stuff that was going on in places like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, where there was real concentration of activists and others. Because in the media at the time, anything about the epidemic was framed in terms of being inevitably fatal, dread disease, no survivors, incurable, terminal illness. It was like the media coverage had taken away any hope of survival, any possibility of survival. And I read that, but then I was living a life that was full of incredibly vibrant people doing important and exciting work, whether it was work in the epidemic or whether it was making their art or raising their children or pursuing their careers, while at the same time managing this burden of a life-threatening illness that was in all likelihood going to kill most of us at the time. And there was sort of such a dichotomy. And so I started thinking about like a People magazine about people with AIDS. Mm-hmm. Just show us in the lives we were leading, and the things that we're happy to share and things that were maybe not so happy. And that turned into the idea of Paws, which was a colloquialism that we coined. At the time, we were talking about different ideas and what to call it, what to call the magazine. And we're really struggling. We call it Life Plus, or we're doing things around plus and stuff. And a friend of mine, Matt Levine in San Francisco, who's my friend, who's always very clever with words and things like that. We were talking about a third party, and I was telling him about somebody, probably somebody very cute I'd met or something. And Matt said, "Is he a posse?" Just kind of like a cute way of asking, was he HIV positive? And it was like a eureka moment. I said, "That's it, Paws." Both because it was a double entendre, right? Mm-hmm. Short for HIV positive, but also for thinking positively, acting positively, and so on. And when we launched the magazine, there were people who didn't understand what it meant, including in the gay press. One columnist in the New York Native, the gay paper in New York, said, people with AIDS starting a magazine called Paws is like Holocaust survivors starting a magazine called Gaz.
Wow.
So it wasn't like universally accepted, but quickly it became the shorthand colloquialism, sort of like what gay is to homosexual, right? Is less clinical than HIV positive. And the idea of it is that it would give people back that possibility of survival by highlighting examples of those of us who were surviving for whatever period of time, making the most of the lives that we had. And I really believe then and today that the connection between one's attitude, the mind-body connection, is very real, still not very well understood. But we know that when we have we say we have a feeling in the pit of our stomach, or the hair on the back of our neck rises, or we get cold feet, those are physiological reactions to some kind of external intellectual stimulus, right? Fear, anger, excitement, whatever. And it seemed to me that the immune system had to work in a similar fashion. If it was assaulted with death sentence messages that took away the possibility of survival, well, on some level internally, your body, your mind is just like, there was a hopelessness with that, like, why even try? If, on the other hand, we were highlighting examples of people who were leading their lives right now, today, as fully and vibrantly as they could, that could also have a positive effect. And that was the idea behind Paws. We were also criticized. You had, it was one of the, I think that was maybe the 4th or 5th issue, one of the early issues. But that one in particular, we got a lot of criticism for it because Ilka Tanya Payan, who was the person on the cover, she's really interesting. She was a novella star in the Spanish language soap series. And she's also an immigration lawyer. And when we talked to her about she appear on Paws, she was very concerned. She'd lost weight, and she was an actress, and her looks were important. And we told her, we will make you just as glamorous as we possibly can. But just because somebody's sick, it doesn't mean they can't look their best. And so we had a great photographer, and we had the hair and makeup people, and it was so exciting. She died not too long after that, but this was, I think, such a happy occasion for her. And it was something we could show, and the interview was quite wonderful as well. I don't think that simply because we were writing about a very difficult circumstance and horrible tragedies and things happening in our lives, that meant it had to be of poor production values and printed in black and white on newsprint. If anything, that was even more reason for us to represent our lives and share our stories as beautifully as we can. So the magazine has always been at a very high sort of literary level, and has really valued the photography and the quality of the stock it was printed on. It's still printed some, but it's mostly online. And I think the New York Times called it a cross between the New England Journal of Medicine and Vanity Fair.
Well, that comparison, I mean, it really does visually this particular cover, and that I love the backstory on this. That's so wonderful. Because it really does, it reminded me when I pulled this particular one out. I didn't intentionally pick this one for any reason other than I had it at hand, and it did remind me of people. And I'm really struck by this sort of underlying idea of showing something that really celebrates the humanity of it, rather than, and there were a lot of different newsletter type things. One of the newsletters that we have on display here is from Project Inform,
right?
Which was an extremely scientific piece, and which was very helpful and informative. It was full of information, but it also didn't have this sort of more the human side of what is this experience like, what does it mean, and how do we interpret it.
I hope you also, and you probably do in your collection somewhere, have copies of DPN, the Diseased Pariah News,
Yeah, actually, I'm really excited about this. We're going to be getting a whole collection of them. They're coming in the next month or so, and yeah, that's
It was, yeah, you reach people in different ways. And, while Paws, while we were criticized, particularly for that cover, making Ilka look so glamorous, Viva la Diva is the cover line. We also, showed people who are obviously very ill. Probably in that issue right there, in my column inside, there's a picture of me with visible cast lesions on it. And at one time we had a consultant who said, "Oh, we can airbrush those out." I said, "No, we're not going to airbrush those out." That was what I looked like, and I was fine with that.
mhm,
And that was sort of the theme of the magazine. We were showing the reality of it, which
mhm,
also included people who are gorgeous and glamorous, and doing
mhm.
things as well as people who were in wheelchairs and in very difficult circumstances. So. Um, but Disease Pariah News, they went quite a step further than ours. It was very irreverent and shocking at times. I think when Beowulf, one of the founders of it, died, I think it was when he died, there were two of them, they claimed, I never knew if this was true or not, but that they mixed some of his ashes in with the ink they used to print it was like a zine format.
Right.
And I got to, I don't know if they really did it or not, it didn't matter, but just the idea of it. And then you'd hand somebody this and then you tell them that. No.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the whole sum of that I think is really interesting. And the thing that I'm curious about, I didn't mention this to you, but the thing that the other thing that strikes me about this, I wanted to run this by you. We've been caught up in a 40-year fever here about HIV, about 1981, 2021, and thinking about the anniversary and everything. And I think we focus a lot of our history pieces about the 80s, of course, because of the discovery and all of the things that fell in with that. But I think when you think about the early 90s and this time that we don't hear as much about from around 1990 to up until the cocktail, and that these numbers, I'm from Cincinnati, in the interior, and I'm a little younger, but we kind of found ourselves flooded. The number of people who had HIV, the number of people who were dying of HIV, the wave finally hit in the heartland, and the numbers are going up. The medications aren't really working that well. And I think there's less emphasis put on that time, but it's sort of the perfect time because there's more and more people who are living with HIV and finding out that they're living with HIV. More and more people that have been coping for quite a while now. We've hit a 10-year mark, and there's not a lot of hope.
And
On the one hand.
more people who are dealing with diagnosis in areas where they're culturally or geographically isolated.
Right.
I lived in Greenwich Village in New York, right? I could
Mhm.
go to the community center a couple blocks from my house every Monday night for the ACT UP meetings, which were as much support group as they were activism. Someone in Cincinnati may not have had such a luxury. People outside of those urban centers, coming out about your HIV status was really a function of privilege, because so many people weren't able to do that. One of the things we found with Paws is um, uh, that we would, we mailed it for free to
Mhm.
anyone who requested it around the country. And then we were mailing it in bulk to community centers and clinics and so on. And we started mailing it in bulk to African-American churches around the country. And at first it was great. There's one church in Tennessee, and I knew the pastor really well. And they were taking like 3 cases of it. They were really like distributing a lot of it. And then after a couple of issues, their reorder request, because they had to send us a fax with how many they wanted, went way, way down. And I thought, what's going on? And I spoke to the pastor, and he said, when it first arrived, it was a nice, attractive magazine. They'd have it at the door after the services, and lots of people picked it up. But after everyone knew what it was about, it then became stigmatizing to pick it up. Oh, you're picking up the AIDS magazine.
Right.
And so that led us to create another magazine called Real Health that was just focused on African-American health issues. Because first of all, none of us live in the isolation of just dealing with HIV. And about 35 or 40% of the content was HIV related, but the rest of the content was on other issues, health issues of particular concern in the African-American community. And that we used to call it, if it could pass the subway test, if somebody could read the magazine on the subway without it being stigmatizing saying it. And then we got the circulation back up again that way. So it was really about finding the different ways to, get information to people. My partner, Javier Morales, was very involved with something called Homo Visionis, which was the first Spanish language public access cable television show. And in New York in the early 90s. And they produced this program. It was like a magazine style format with interviews, but they'd always have a lot of AIDS content in it, and activism in it. But they found from the feedback from the viewers, the letters and the calls they got, is with tremendous frequency, it was being watched by the entire family. And that it was very typical for the mom to be making healthcare decisions for everybody in the family. Much more so than in like Anglo communities or whatever. And so then they adjusted their programming so that they really were speaking to the whole family, sitting there watching the program. And that is, something that at a grassroots level, people in the communities, we know how to speak to others in our communities, whichever they are. And, government agencies and large nonprofits are typically not very good at that. Mm-hmm. So, I'm a great advocate for community generated media, for us telling our own stories. That's why I commented on how much I appreciate the series that you're doing of documenting the lives, not just of people who are well known or doing this, but just the lives, because what you're doing is a little bit like Steven Spielberg's Shoah project with Holocaust survivors, because there are fewer and fewer of us, who were around in the 80s and can speak firsthand to what we saw, what we witnessed. Whether it was in Cincinnati, or whether it was in New York, and getting those firsthand reports, those eyewitness reports to what we experienced documented is so critical. When I travel and when my memoir came out, you publish a memoir and you're inviting people to tell you their stories as well, which I
Sure.
joy for me because I found it interesting. But I really encouraged, everywhere I go, for people to talk into a tape recorder. Don't worry about being a writer. Don't worry about the plot or the structure of it. Just start talking about what you remember, about the friends you've lost, about the experiences you've had. And whenever I got stuck on my book, my editor, she always said, let chronology be your friend. What happened next? What was after that?
Right.
And to get these recordings, so many HIV service providers around the country, the ones that are still like kind of HIV specific, when I'm traveling and I'm going and meeting people, them invariably there's some volunteer who's been there since the beginning, right? And it might be an older person now who's like retired, but they still come in and they work at the reception desk or the intake desk or whatever. That's where the institutional histories and the histories of that community reside. And we need to be harvesting those stories. We need to get them documented. So that's why I think what you're doing is really, really important. And it'll feel a lot more important 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years from now when people are studying this period and trying to understand what happened than it might feel today. Because the other thing that we've not gotten around to, and forgive me for going off on a tangent here, but we haven't really looked at those early years. We haven't looked at what we, certainly as gay community, might have done differently. What are the mistakes that we made early on? Nor has there been a real reckoning with the truth, I believe, that if the government had responded differently, if we had political and public policy and public health leadership that was different, this epidemic would have been vastly smaller. We wouldn't be here today with 35 or 40 million people dead and that many more still living with HIV. You know, people talk about the great success of developing treatments in record time, this and that, everything, like somehow this epidemic's been handled brilliantly. It hasn't. It's been an unmitigated disaster, and there are tens of millions of people dead who didn't have to die if we had had different leadership early on. And we need to study that at every level, at the global level, at the national level, but also within our own communities and our neighborhoods, so that we can learn from that and hopefully, you know, not have it happen again. And we're learning some of these lessons again with COVID.
Absolutely.
There will be
Yeah.
other pathogens coming down the pike. We can count on it.
Yeah. You know, I am gonna edit this, cut out this little piece and play it over and over to remind myself about this. Really early on, I heard this quote that history is a myth agreed upon. I've thought about that a lot in my work here at the museum. I didn't train to be a historian. I, was a social worker and a counselor in Cincinnati and worked in HIV prevention and social science research around HIV. But when I got here, our chronology stopped at 2014 because that's when the museum opened. And a lot of people that would go through the chronology, I started here in 2019, they would say, well, where's the rest of it? You know, where's the rest of up to the present? And I thought, well, that's a really interesting question about how do you know what rises to the level of this is news that we should have in this. And I think you raise a really good point that that I want to be careful of here at the museum, that we want to be careful about, and that the founders of the group, which is, by the way, called, the group that founded the museum is called Positive Attitudes, and it has the Z, is that they wanted to be sure that these stories got told as they really were. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting. We're now in a new location where we get a lot more traffic from people who didn't intentionally come to the World AIDS Museum, right, and then find themselves in here and they're surprised by some of these things. And a lot of times it's like, oh, there's been so much progress. And you're right, it gets lost of how crazy it all was at the beginning. And really throughout. I mean, so one of the stories that we wrote for the new, for our new redesign of the exhibit is about Obama lifting the travel ban, mm-hmm. Restricting people from entry into the US because of being HIV positive. And that raises this really great question that we didn't really have in the chronology before, is when did that come about and how did that come about in the 80s? Because that goes all the way back to the 80s when they decided to put this thing in place. And it would be very easy to lose that, mm-hmm. and just, hum over that. Well, that, like, that's just a little footnote. And it's like, no, it's a pretty big deal. And it affected a lot of people's lives.
Well, yes, and there is a real effort underway and from many interests to kind of rewrite history or to sort of document history in the way people want to see it. That's why I particularly love memoir, because it's that person's story, right? It's not anybody else's story, it's that person's story. That's what they're telling, that's what they experienced, and it's firsthand. We've seen things. There was a documentary that Ken Cole did about AMFAR, about the origins of American Foundation for AIDS Research. And I think it's garbage. It has some interesting interviews in it, but it is not the truth. In all sorts of ways, it ignores and minimizes the role of people with AIDS themselves in creating the organization, and it creates a mythology. We see timelines. There's one timeline about the early years of the epidemic, and it had as one of the important milestones was the date in 1989 when the federal government recommended Bactrim prophylaxis to keep people from dying of PCP, pneumocystis pneumonia, which was the #1 killer of people with AIDS in the 1980s. And they had the milestone 1989 when the federal government did this. Well, you know, the more important date was 2 years earlier in 1987, when Michael Callan and a group of activists took the train to Washington to meet with Tony Fauci and to, as Michael wrote later, to beg him to make that recommendation to clinicians around the country and communities around the country, because frontline physicians in New York, particularly Joseph Sonnabend, had discovered that this very inexpensive, widely available sulfa drug that was used to treat people who had pneumocystis was also incredibly effective at preventing it. And so people whose immune systems were weakened, that were at great risk of getting PCP, they could take a low dose of this drug and keep from getting it. And they tried to get the federal government to do that, and Fauci refused. And on the train back to New York, Michael Callan wrote a note to history because he knew what a serious failing this was. And between that date and 2 years later, when the federal government finally did make that recommendation, about 17,000 people, mostly gay men, suffocated to death from PCP. And a significant number of them would have survived had that news been shared. But that earlier date, that didn't make it on the timeline. The timeline is about celebrating 1989 when the federal government did that. So we're seeing these kind of revisionist, sorts of things going on. And by the way, there's history being made every day. Right now, I'll tell you, as somebody's been involved in this in a long time, the energy and the influence of the networks of people living with HIV today is more impressive, is more sophisticated, more mutually supportive and cooperative than at any time in the history of the epidemic, as far as I'm concerned. And these are groups that are not well funded. They're not especially well known, like the Positive Women's Network, Positively Trans, National Network of Transgender People with HIV, the Reunion Project, Long-Term Survivors, Thrive SS, which is in Atlanta and other places in the South, which focuses on young Black gay men, the SERO Project, and then our sort of collaboration is something called the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, which is unincorporated, unfunded. It's a collaboration of trust amongst these networks. And we just produced a roadmap for the federal government, policy guidance for how to address the epidemic that is incredibly sophisticated. So there is real serious excitement right now. Sometimes when I'm talking with young activists, there's almost like a wistful sort of like, oh, all the exciting days were back in the 80s, the early 90s, that they're like too late to the party. That's not true. It's so urgent right now. There's so many things. The epidemic looks different, where the alliances are different, but the crisis is still there for many communities in this country. And we're seeing a convergence of activism around people addressing mass incarceration, addressing sex work, addressing drug policy, addressing the overcriminalization of young people, Black and brown bodies with HIV. HIV has sort of become the nexus, and a lot of these efforts, they're truly intersectional, because you can't address this in isolation in the silo of just HIV and expect to be successful. And that is very different from the early years. It's very exciting. It's incredibly vibrant, and it needs the help of anybody who wants to get engaged.
Absolutely. Well, we've only got a few more minutes left, and we didn't even get to things about criminalization. So I think we're going to have to schedule another one of these later on. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, when you compare the roots of Paws and going all the way back to the community prescription service, and you talk about typing something out or photocopying it and just mailing it out to people, in comparison now with all the social media and all of the connections that can, when I look back on that time and think about digging for information and then disseminating it, and how miraculous it is the way that we did that in those years. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that, about, the role of the internet in that, and social media, and,
Well, I mean, it's obviously been, profound. I mean, I sometimes wonder what it would have been like if we'd had the internet when we were like, planning ACT UP actions and so on. But there's another side to it as well, which is that bad information can circulate quickly
Right.
as well. We've all seen the not very pretty side of social media, but on the whole, it's for getting out new developments and treatments and things we learned. It's just incredible how much more efficient it is, and how it enables a lot more people to be engaged. You don't have the same degree of isolation for somebody who was living in rural Iowa, where I'm from. And if you were diagnosed and you were there, that was a pretty lonely experience. And now it's much less so, because you can connect with a community online, you can contribute, you can learn from that. So I do wonder, it's kind of like part of this is the concern about data collection and molecular surveillance now, where when somebody tests positive, they're doing the genetic sequencing and then trying to find clusters, and all that data is going somewhere. And we know there are going to be abuses of it. There have been already. We've already had all sorts of abuses with the names reporting databases. And in some ways, it feels like the epidemic has kind of been in the forefront. I mean, it has been in the forefront of all sorts of sort of revolutionary changes in medicine and in data collection and in the relationship between the state and the health of the citizens. And I think we're at the beginning stages of that. So it makes what we've experienced and done and witnessed and seen that much more important that it be understood and shared.
Wow. So many things to be thinking about here in this. I can't believe how the time has flown. We are kind of toward the end of our time here in this, but you've certainly given me, and I think our audience, a lot to be thinking about in this. Quick wrap-up question, because it's amazing all these different things that you've done and are doing, and you're doing all this, and you're the mayor of a small town in Pennsylvania. What do you do to unwind and relax? That's like always our kind of closing question.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have a wonderful partner who is a brilliant gardener, and I've developed an appreciation for the beauty he's created in our lawn here. And that's been kind of a new thing in my life. The pandemic got me, I'm somebody who, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, but for most of my life, food hasn't been a lot more than fuel. And in the last few years, but especially since the pandemic, I've really learned to enjoy food and cook more. So those are things, and I read and all the usual things, but mostly just hanging out with my partner and my dog.
And that is a really good thing. That's something that fills me back up too. So, well, Sean, I really have appreciated the opportunity to spend this time with you and to just learn from your experiences. And like I said, I'm going to come back and listen to that one part again, thinking about what we're here to do, which you're right, is so important in getting those stories out. So I appreciate you being so open with us, and I hope that we'll get to talk again soon.
Very happy to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we do this every first and third Wednesday of the month, and we always have interesting conversations here on the Spotlight interview series, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you.